I was in the first ReMODEL, and I was trying to think about what could I offer to this conversation. And so the idea of the premise of what sculpture might be usually is thought about as a concept of making. So my interest in this first go around was the idea of unmaking. And there's a few ideas that have occurred in the art world related to that. And one of the things that's related to that also is this idea of the fundamental ideas of what is sculpture. So in Dennis Oppenheim's piece, this idea of tapping the wall, which Dana has an update on that was wonderful. The idea of what is this, to ask a very fundamental question. And so the idea of a site work that is just a stake, where you actually can sort of like delineate a space instead of building a work to do that. Those are all kinds of introductions to this idea of unmaking in a sense. And one of the things that I followed in that first lecture was this idea of taking a construction site, the classic object of a 2x4, and sort of working backwards and finding out its origins back into a kind of natural cycle as a way of thinking about the materials that we use. So this is also related to Dana's. I'm not sure if this is the first time that this was actually said, but this was when Arthur Eddington said it, which was the idea of the two tables of the physicist. The one that they write on, that they're actually writing their physics papers, and the other one that they know about, which is actually just vibrations. So the space between the actual physicality of the atoms and the neutrons and things, the particles, is like immense. So there's this kind of dichotomy that I think is a really interesting premise for thinking about sculpture as a philosophical endeavor. It's related to essentially to the questions and choices and also assumptions that we make about what is sculpture and how do we create a trajectory through the making of a work, and what informs those choices. So this is just a historical kind of lineage of some things where people have been thinking about that, and Marcel Duchamp's chocolate grinder work. This was a couple of different things that have to do with this idea of instructions, or how do you sort of create an attitude or an intensity or a relationship to the practice itself of sculpture. So this is John Cage. These are a few of his instructions, which the idea of find a place you trust and then try trusting it for a while as a kind of entry point into something that you might be thinking about. It's a really fundamental idea. And this was handed out, I don't know if it was actually physically handed out because it wasn't his style, but a teacher of mine was Bill Wiley back in the 60s. But this is a Samurai Creed, which was a very intense sort of like list of instructions about how to view the world. And so this issue of the assumptions that are related to the nature of reality, to our perceptions, to our worldview, this is a kind of variant of that, and it's now being played out through post-structuralism and all the sort of philosophical discourses about all the different kinds of worldviews that form these sort of premises for an activity. And Bruce Nauman was one of Wiley's students, and so coming off of something like that, this is not a direct thing because I don't know that one led to the other, but this idea of an attitude about how to think, about how to question. And then another student actually of Wiley's, who's Howard Fried at the Art Institute, he was the originator of what was then called the Performance Video Department. And I remember in the late 70s there was this pretty amazing argument between Jim Pomeroy and Howard Fried as to whether video should be in sculpture because of it had its historical relationship, or whether it needed its own practice. And so Howard won out, and that became the Performance Video Department, which then became New Genres. And New Genres has defined itself as a department that has no definition, which is kind of like what we've been talking about, what sculpture is about now. It's kind of a curious thing. So this is a quote that Dennis Oppenheim had written about some work of Howard's, about the idea of the very premise of how do you enter into the question of what might be even a valid artwork or might even be a sculpture. So those are really interesting things to me that form a foundation. This is just an image by Reinhard Munka, who's a German artist, that was in a book called The European Iceberg by Germano Solant. And the text that he wrote as his, your artist statement was actually a very long piece written by an engineer about how do you create a tunnel through a mountain. So that kind of overlap, like when we were looking at the Edgerton thing about pulling from science, this idea of pulling from other people who are thinking about things that are maybe in the same vein as the type of work that you might be attempting. So Tricia Donnelly was just a student from UCLA and then Yale. And this idea of a sound work, that the trajectory all the way down the line might become, as it says, listening, it flattens into an object, is a comb-like structure. So there is no real object there, but it's the illusion, it's the premise that an object might be somehow found within something. This is one of her scores. And then a few images that I think are kind of salient to this idea, this Giuseppe Pannone's, they're mirrored, eyeglass things that are sort of like reflecting the idea of the world and, in a sense, actually closing it off. So his perception is closed off, but the world comes in or is reflected in it. And then Linda Benglis's, this was from the 1974 Art Forum, just appeared, as you open up the front cover, there was this image. And then the last couple of images have to do with this concept of cycle as a kind of philosophical thing. And this is Marina Bermovic redoing Joseph Beuys's work, explaining art to a dead hare. So this kind of remining of history as a procedure. And then Rodney Graham's work of the pirate. You probably have seen this movie where he wakes up on a beach and he goes over and realizes that he's hungry, so he shakes a coconut tree, and the coconut falls and hits him on the head and knocks him out, and then the story starts all over again. So this concept of a cycle is also played out in this reading machine down here, where he's mined a text for something and made a machine to be able to investigate that text. So these become sort of premise-like things that are informing these works, which I think is, rather than the idea of learning materials like plaster and metal and things like that, the idea of thought itself as being a material, I think, is an important thing to have in this conversation. Thank you.